In some way, I think I probably got the easiest task talking about fake news, because I looked at the program. There's so many talks which will inevitably force me to revise my account. So it's very nice to be able to be the first one, get it out of the way, and then lean back and hear everybody else, or many of you, talk about fake news. Fake news arguably is one of those terms that has become ubiquitous, which are often used with great conviction, and yet there isn't really any clear understanding of the term. And it's a term that has emerged in hard-fought political battles. So one can have pretty substantial worries about whether one can actually engage in the task of defining fake news without actually getting embroiled in those political battles. Nonetheless, that's what I want to do today. I want to put forward a definition of what fake news is, a tentative one, no doubt. But I also want to address the motivation. Why should we even attempt to define fake news? Or why don't we just conclude that any such attempt is inevitably doomed? So in order to do that, what I'll do is I want to basically walk you through some of the origins of the term fake news, both the phenomenon and the concept of fake news and its history. And then I want to basically look at some concurrent definitions that have been proposed before then proposing my own definition, and also importantly testing it against what I take to be some desiderata for what the term fake news, if we're going to use the term, ought to be able to do. So let me just take on these points one by one. It may seem a little quaint now, but as recently as the mid-2000s, when the term fake news came to be used in connection with things like The Daily Show or the Colbert Report on American cable television, the term actually had a mildly progressive ring to it. People were dissatisfied with the pretty uncritical stance that much of mainstream news was taking with respect to politicians' pronouncements and the statements coming out of corporations. So what they did is that they created these fake news shows to satirize traditional news by reporting in a style similar to network and cable TV news, but amplifying the biases found in those traditional news sources, basically to ensure that viewers hear them, these biases, loud and clear. So basically fake news then was a contribution to, if you like, media literacy. If you fast forward 10 years though, then the term has not only changed its meaning, it's come to become associated with biased sources that do not even shy away from fabricating news claims and presenting them as real. It's also been co-opted through tactical usage by those who wish to cast doubt on even legitimate traditional news sources. So there has been definitely an evolution of the term, and we need to get a better understanding of why that happened and how that happened and what's left for us to basically do with this term if we're going to use it. In fact, some commentators have considered that the term fake news itself has become suspect and problematic and even illegitimate, since it may have become, as for example Matthew Dentis puts it, merely a rhetorical device used by the powerful to crush dissent. Others have worried that it's not clear that fake news, post-truth, post-fact really mean anything, that they add any new descriptive resources, so that we might just as well stick with the old and more established terms. And similar to the earlier quote, that, quote, fake news in particular is a propagandistic term that undermines democratic values. So all in all, this suggestion goes, fake news is at best an unnecessarily vague label for phenomena that we somehow already understand or are familiar with under a different name. At worst, the term becomes yet another weapon in the arsenal of those who basically stage a full-scale assault on science, liberal institutions, and the notion of expertise in general. And that's, of course, a stark choice we are facing, so we should definitely be concerned about the implications of what this suggestion means. Now, let me be clear, I share the worry that the term fake news may be co-opted, and in fact has been co-opted by shady forces in an effort to undermine respectable and reliable, trustworthy epistemic authorities. But I also think that there's still a dominant usage, perhaps sort of original usage of the term, that does attempt to pick out a very real phenomenon. And in particular, this phenomenon is not I take it, and I want to argue, captured fully or adequately by established terms like lying, like propaganda, or even bullshit. So we would do ourselves, I think, no favor to hastily dismiss the label as somehow illegitimate just because Donald Trump has taken to calling CNN and the New York Times purveyors of fake news, because he does so wrongly on the definition that I want to propose. So in other words, I'm starting from the assumption that the phenomenon of fake news came first, the tactical usage of the phrase as an epithet directed at one's political opponents comes second, and so we'd be well advised to basically come up with a tentative, workable definition of fake news. And I think even the recent wave of interest in the notion of fake news actually does reflect that. This primacy of an original usage superseded by its co-option by the different end of the political spectrum. Think about how fake news played a role in the American elections a year and a half ago. Many of the worries about fake news had to do with fake news about Hillary Clinton being peddled in the campaign and the run-up to the election. And then Donald Trump, only as president-elect in December, started basically tweeting and calling traditional news sources fake news. So we've got definitely a primacy, a succession here in terms of events, original usage, and then its co-option later on. So that's basically my starting point. I do want to still say a few words about sort of detractors of the term. There are a couple of further objections. Some people have argued that the ascendancy of the term fake news would be only justified if something enormous happened around 2015, 2016 that had a huge influence on how belief was shaped at a psychological level. But I think this is something of a straw man, at least in my perception, because nobody's really claiming that somehow our brains got rewired in the year 2015, 2016. That would be a ludicrous and outlandish claim. But I think what's not a ludicrous or outlandish claim is that something in the production of news and our aggregation of news has changed. So nobody also needs to claim that there's absolute novelty to the phenomenon. We can motivate the introduction of a new term even when all the different pieces are in place already, and it's only a matter of quantity and how these things come together which maybe motivates us to pick out what is now a more recognizable phenomenon than before. So as I said, claiming that our collective processes of belief formation were somehow rewired would be a pretty freaky claim to make. But what's not so freaky is the thought that our collective practices of generating purported news items and factual reports, aggregating them, and, if you like, on the demand side of things, consuming them have, in fact, changed significantly, as I think the sort of wave of social media sites and the pervasive use of social media indicates. So again, none of the ingredients, whether psychological, social, or otherwise, need to be genuinely new for us to be legitimately speaking about fake news as an important, or as a phenomenon of renewed importance perhaps, and finding a label for the novel way in which these pre-existing factors now come together. Now, having said all this, we should certainly not make the mistake of being naive and nostalgic about old traditional media. The heroic image of journalists selflessly gathering all the news that's fit to print and then putting them out there without fear or favor. I mean, that's a pretty nostalgic, idealized version of journalism. So, you only need to go back in history to see that people like William Randolph Hearst, the 19th century publisher of the New York Journal, basically were purveyors of fake news at times. He was notorious for launching a fake news campaign following the explosion of the warship USS Maine in Cuba, which Hearst's papers resolutely blamed on the Spanish, leading to a war in 1897. And even competing papers at the time, like the New York Evening Post, were then lamenting the gross misrepresentation of the facts and, quote, the deliberate invention of tales calculated to excite the public. So while the faking of news stories then has been around for quite a long time, arguably, every new communication technology, from the telegraph in the 19th century to electronic social media in the 21st century, has unleashed new possibilities of deception, new possibilities of amplification of news making the rounds, and of fabricating results, making them look like the real thing. And this alone, of course, calls for social epistemological analysis, which is, I assume, why we have so many talks on the program, trying to engage this issue in a constructive and critical way. So let me now turn from this brief sort of preliminary remarks to the more recent wave of fake news and the ascendancy of the term in the last couple of years. Because since Trump's election victory, and I take it to be an open question to what extent it really was influenced by fake news making the rounds. I mean, the causal influence is something which is a different story about how it can shape electoral outcomes. But since Trump's election victory, various characterizations of the term have been bandied about by scholars as well as by pundits and journalists. And in response to this flurry of activity, some have called it, the term I mean fake news, a catch-all term with multiple definitions, and that's certainly how it's used in everyday discourse and in the media. So when I'm now developing my own take on fake news, I will do my best to engage closely with some of those, or a cross-section of those proposed definitions, all the while keeping in mind that many of these definitions come from applied contexts. They come from legal scholars, they come from journalists working on, sort of in the newsroom, and so we can perhaps not always hold these tentative characterizations up to the same rigorous standards that we aspire to in, say, analytic epistemology. So there has to be a little bit of a caveat here, but that's why I think we have to approach these definitions also in a fairly constructive way. Now, unsurprisingly, the term is strongly associated with the internet. The internet, so, is a main component in many of the characterizations that have been put forward, so much so that some have defined fake news explicitly as, quote, the online publication of false statements of fact. So focus here on online publication. Also, the dubious nature of the claims in question and the motivations behind them are captured by phrases that equate fake news with false news, or with stories, quote, invented entirely from thin air, intentionally or knowingly false statements and facts. These are all snippets from later quotations, and quotations are used in the full paper. The deliberate spread of misinformation, and with reports that have, quote, no factual basis whatsoever. These are all snippets from quotations that I'm using in the full paper. And these are no doubt widely shared sentiments in relation to fake news, and any tentative definition or any proposed definition would be, should take due account of the fact that this is what people generally associate with the term. And does, of course, raise important questions for analysis, again, which we need to test our definitions against. For example, why does fake news seem to have risen to new, or at least renewed, importance and significance with the mass adoption of social media? How does fake news manage to maintain the semblance with real news, even as it gets further and further away from reality and further detached? And is the emergence of fake news necessarily tied to the malicious intent of individual human agents? A question that may, for example, be important for the legal ramifications of fake news. And of course, we can't expect any single definition by itself to somehow provide answers to these definitions, but we should judge a definition by whether it feeds into genuine attempts to answer these questions and explain and analyze and describe the phenomenon of fake news. So what are some of the current definitions then? What do we see when we look at the sort of, when we survey the wide range of definitions that have been put out there? Well, there are a few clusters, thematic clusters in terms of what recurs in definitions of fake news. So, well, first cluster concerns the medium in which fake news appears. I already mentioned the internet features very strongly here. But if that is the case, if it is indeed the case that the internet plays an important role in the recent spate of fake news or fake news allegations, then I would argue this is itself an explanandum. That's something we should be explaining, not something we should be building right into the definition of what constitutes fake news. On top of that, after all, a piece of fake news doesn't cease to be fake news just because it gets picked up by the mainstream media on broadcast television or makes it into some op-ed piece in a printed newspaper. So it can't be just the medium of dissemination alone. A second cluster of concerns revolves around the sometimes extreme disconnect that we find between fake news and reality. I think it's best illustrated by way of example, the curious or notorious example of the Pizzagate episode, a conspiracy theory for those of you who are blissfully unaware of what Pizzagate is, of the alleged collusion between prominent Democratic politicians, notably Hillary Clinton, pedophile rings, and a number of popular restaurants which were set to provide cover. Somehow, I mean, don't ask me about the details, but that was the mix that went into this conspiracy theory. And this led to at least one shooting incident at one of the restaurants, perpetrated by a self-radicalized 28-year-old man who claimed to be self-investigating the alleged conspiracy. And somehow, whenever it's a white guy, you never call him self-radicalized, but he was in fact self-radicalized through consumption of a lot of fake news in response to this Pizzagate episode. And I suspect that it is with respect to these kinds of conspiracy theories that some practitioners, for example, like the editor of the Idaho Post-Register, Roger Plotho here, argue that, quote, fake news should be defined as a story invented entirely from thin air to entertain or mislead on purpose. Other commentators from a more scholarly angle echo this. So we've got economists here, Hunt Alcott and Matthew Gensko, who identify as fake news, quote, news stories that have no factual basis but are presented as news. But I think any attempt to reduce fake news to just any sort of disconnect from reality is problematic. Now, if we define fake news as news that contains false or inaccurate information, then it's inadequate because there's just a lot of high-quality news that will necessarily, through our limitations on what we know, involve some inaccuracies and some falsehood. But an honest mistake about some irrelevant detail in a larger report doesn't render that report an instance of fake news. What's more, suggesting that fake news consists of completely fabricated claims and that it has no factual basis, a theme that has come up multiple times in the definitions I've rehearsed here, mischaracterizes the phenomenon in other ways too. After all, much of the initial credibility of fake news derives precisely from its real-world connection, from the fact that there are real-world backstories, and in fact almost all successful fake news reports purport to be about real-world actors and entities. After all, fake news is passing itself off as news. It's not a genre of fiction. So many fake news stories are not wholly false, but are a mix of deliberate falsehoods mixed in together with well-known truths as a means of obfuscation. Of course, we also know that deliberately misleading one's audience is entirely possible without relying on falsehoods, simply through selective representation or presentation of partial truths. And this suggests that one should not overstate the degree of disconnect that exists between fake news and reality, or in any case, it shouldn't be built right into the definition because there can be varying degrees of inaccuracy in fake news. Now, having eliminated the medium of dissemination as the sole arbiter of whether something is fake news or not, and mere lack of veracity, meaning there's a disconnect between the fake news report and the world, I think two main issues now remain. There's the deliberate manner in which unreliable or otherwise deceptive information is being presented as news, and there's the way in which fake news outlets mimic the appearance and the traditional markers of credibility of established news sources. I think this is very nicely captured by some of the few, but judging from the conference program by now, growing number of philosophers' definitions of fake news. Here's, for example, Neil Levy's characterization. He writes, quote, fake news is the presentation of false claims that purport to be about the world in a format and with a content that resembles the format and content of legitimate media organizations. I should emphasize this is not meant as a conceptual definition of what fake news is. It's presented only as a way of fixing the reference for discussion, as Levy puts it, not serve as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And Regina Rini, who's also got a talk on the program of this conference, I think comes up with this extremely good characterization here. A fake news story is one that purports to describe events in the real world, typically by mimicking the conventions of traditional news media, yet is known by its creators to be significantly false and is transmitted with the two goals of being widely retransmitted and of deceiving at least some of its audience. I have a lot of sympathy for both of these definitions, not least because they go some way towards addressing the explanatory challenge of why fake news has become such a force, for example, in the online world. Because never before has it been this easy to mimic the conventions of traditional media reports. And if you look at how social media passes on news reports, if you add a link to your Facebook timeline, it strips away all the traditional markers of sort of traditional news media in terms of layout, in terms of the masthead, and all sorts of other things. Every link looks just the same when it appears in your news feed on a social media site. So I think that's a good, sort of pragmatically good aspect of these definitions. Both definitions also rightly, in my opinion, leave open the precise nature of the deception and manipulation that's at stake. Because as we'll see in a minute, purveyors of fake news need not intend to deceive their audience by getting them to believe the news that they're spreading. At least that need not be the primary goal of fake news purveyors and creators of fake news. Now, just a few remarks before I move on to the more positive definition I want to propose. Similarity in appearance to legitimate news sources is certainly an important feature of fake news. It's because, after all, fake news aims at being disseminated and recirculated. But it doesn't all alone suffice as a demarcation criterion either. At the very least, I think there must be a measurable or predictable degree of success in achieving circulation and uptake through the mimicking of these features. Because take examples like satirical websites, which I mentioned early on, like The Daily Show on American television, and The Onion, the satirical news website, which now has a video channel and all this sort of stuff. They have many of the trappings of traditional news shows, but they operate on the assumption that the audience can very well tell the difference and recognize the satire involved. We all know, except of course when on social media sometimes people overlook that this is a link from The Onion, that these are not real websites, even though they look the part, they have the language, they have all the jingles and the kind of, sort of rubrics that you would expect from a proper news website. And as it happens, of course, sometimes these things go wrong. The Iranian government, I think, once mistook one of the spoof stories of The Onion for the real thing, and they filed a diplomatic complaint, but then probably no one has ever accused them of having a great sense of humor. So there's that kind of occasional mistake that happens in this connection. So I think more precisely what's distinctive about the wide circulation of fake news and about its deceptive character is not that they are the result of individual intent, but that they are due to systemic features in the design of the sources and mechanisms that give rise to them and that circulate them. So in other words, and I'm now leading up to my own definition here, for a report to be considered fake news, it must in fact mislead a relevant audience, and it must do so in virtue of the way it is designed to pass itself off as news, at least to the relevant target audience, and that's going to be one of the main ingredients of my definition. Now, just putting this a bit into context, further moving away from fake news definitions to the broader topic of disinformation, there might be resistance to calling fake news a form of news at all, for the same reason that one might resist calling disinformation a form of information. As Fred Dretske puts it, false information, misinformation, and grimace disinformation are not varieties of information any more than a decoy duck is a kind of duck. Unfortunately, the problem that I see with this definition is that for the recipient of a piece of disinformation, or for someone who's confronted with an instance of fake news, it does little good to be told that they should only accept what they're told if in fact it meets the required standards of veracity and truthfulness. So making information and news success terms in a way dodges, and I think, the doxastic challenge here, namely how to respond to claims that are being presented as news to us, as true by a putative news source, given that for all we know they may or may not be fake news. And I think that's very much an open question for someone who first encounters such a claim. So we need to grant, I think, for the purpose of argument and definition here, that fake news falls as much under the same category of claims presented to us by a putative news source as real news does. And only once we acknowledge that from the recipient of an item of news, this looks very much indistinguishable from fake news, looks indistinguishable from real news, at least in many instances. It's only from this vantage point that we can then turn our attention to the glaring differences between them. For one, fake news is misleading in much the same way that disinformation is misleading, namely it leads to the likely formation of false beliefs. So in order to be likely to create false beliefs, a report need not have in fact misled anyone. You could imagine perhaps it was encountered only by an extremely critical subset of reasoners who were not taken in by it, when in fact everybody else or the average person would have been taken in by it. What matters is that all else being equal, and you could also read this as considering the levels of media literacy that we have, for example, in society, a piece of fake news that is released is likely to result in false beliefs on the part of the target audience. The fact that it often does, after all, is what makes fake news nowadays a politically urgent phenomenon. So there are a couple of features I've identified so far: being presented as news, being likely to mislead its target audience, but they don't suffice yet for demarcating fake news from accidentally false reports. Consider that even the most carefully vetted editorial process can give rise to occasional and occasionally glaring mistakes. And there have been cases of respectable news sources, like here the Chicago Daily Tribune, basically getting things wrong, substantially so. By contrast, fake news is misleading its target audience in a non-accidental way. That is, it must be likely to mislead deliberately, and systematically. But this is still not the final word, I want to argue. Why not? Why do we need an even more fine-grained characterization? Well, for one, we need to get clearer what is meant by the phrase likely to mislead deliberately, that I've been using a couple of times now, because clearly it's plausible that at some point in the process of creating fake news stories, there's human intention involved. Someone somewhere is putting a claim out there that they have fabricated. This need not be the actual source that we get the report from, since fake news is typically aimed at being picked up by unsuspecting intermediaries. So you get a message through your newsfeed from a trusted friend, and that's why you give it any credence, not because of any prior experience with, say, the website that it's taken from. So what I want to argue is that it will typically be someone who seeks to achieve a secondary goal by misleading others into believing the claim in question. And what kind of goal might this be? One might expect the motive of those who create fake news to be closely connected to the content of the claims they're peddling. This was, after all, a common assumption again in the 2016 US elections. The vast majority of fake news websites consisted of baseless allegations against Hillary Clinton. It wasn't exclusive to allegations against Hillary Clinton, but it was the dominant sort of mode of fake news. And it was thought, at the time at least, that those who produced these reports aimed to ruin what looked to be a pretty sure win by Hillary Clinton, at least at one point. But as it turned out, many of the fake news websites, this won't come as news to you because I'm sure you've heard about this before, were actually run by sometimes teenagers based in Macedonia, and one village in particular had registered hundreds of sites and was running them from abroad, basically peddling new fake news to an American audience. These teenagers had no stake in the election outcome. Their main goal was to generate revenue from online ads. So in short, the fake news reports were mere clickbait. And to the extent that they wanted their audience to believe the falsehoods that they were peddling, they did so only in the hope that this would get them to share, pass on the reports, thereby increasing the audience, thereby adding to the ad revenue generated from these websites. So belief was just a means to the end of increasing web traffic. So the manipulation here was not about getting people to believe what they were being told, but rather getting them to share these claims that were more or less detached from the truth, or they were detached from the truth, and thereby generating income. So what matters more than belief then is that the purveyors of fake news deliberately engage in practices that they can reasonably expect to lead to false beliefs, irrespective of whether they themselves have a stake in those beliefs or whether they're just in it for the money. I mean, there may be people who have a stake in it because they're political activists, but as it happens in the cases here, these were people who were just in it for the money. One could argue, and I know this relates again to another talk of this conference, that fake news is, because it's unconstrained by the truth, it's essentially a form of bullshit. It's a form of bullshit, as Nikhil Mukherjee puts it, bullshit asserted in the form of publication. But it seems to me that this does not capture what goes on in the case of Macedonian clickbait farms. Not only were they unconstrained by the truth, they were, but they played to their audience's pre-existing biases and views in an expert way, manipulating their audience in deceptive, if ultimately apolitical ways. So I think we want to move a little bit beyond the generic definition of bullshit here, even published bullshit, and actually, attribute a particular function to fake news. So, because the spread of false beliefs is not merely here, as it were, a side effect of fake news, but it's a direct result of its function. And this is unlike traditional mainstream sources. Mainstream news sources, I've said it before, they make mistakes. The less reliable amongst them make more mistakes. But even a relatively high error rate of a traditional news source is still compatible with the function of conveying the truth. Not so, I would argue, in the case of fake news sources. So if we draw on all these distinctions I've just made and my sort of take on them, what I want to suggest then is the following definition, Fn star, which has the following, which I hope, or at least that's my intention here, captures the most distinctive features. And that is the following definition, that fake news is the deliberate presentation of manipulative and misleading content as news, where the content is manipulative and misleading by design. Now, why do I call this Fn star rather than Fn? Because in the corresponding paper that I've written on the topic, I use a definition Fn, which since then, having presented it at conferences, I was forced to revise slightly, and I'm sure that we'll get Fn star prime or something like this after this conference is over. So I've made modifications. I'll be happy to elaborate on what modifications I've made in Q&A, but I don't want to, this is not an exegetical issue, of my take on the topic. This is for the purpose of argument what I want to convince you of. Much hinges, of course, on the phrase by design, but that phrase is intended rather to reflect what is novel about fake news, namely its systemic dimension. So individual intentions on the part of its originators have a role to play, no doubt, but it is systemic features inherent in the design of the sources and channels of dissemination that imbue it with significance. So again, by design here means systemic features inherent in the design of the sources and channels of dissemination of fake news. So I want to conclude by testing this proposed definition Fn star against two questions, as it were, and how well they fare in answering them. First, to what extent does it succeed in delineating fake news from related but distinct types of public disinformation? I can only go over a few of those here. The full discussion is in the paper. And how well does it fare in helping explain the recent rise of fake news, both in the run-up to the US elections and more generally on electronic social media? And I'll say a few words about each in turn. Now, misleading claims can, of course, give rise to false beliefs in any number of ways. A poorly worded headline in an otherwise accurate news article can mislead in this way. So can an honest factual mistake. Neither constitutes, on my definition, fake news, and I think it shouldn't constitute fake news. And that's reflected by this definition by reserving the label of fake news for certain cases of deliberate presentations of manipulative and misleading content. Now, not all deliberate presentations of false or misleading content are instances of fake news. Consider things like false advertising, False advertising may systematically misrepresent the facts by exaggerating, for example, the benefits of a particular product. But such claims are misleading. They may get wide circulation even, but as long as they're not presented in a format that could be easily mistaken as a news report, they do not constitute fake news. Even chronically sloppy journalism, resulting in a large number of misleading claims being presented as news, does not in and of itself qualify as fake news, unless the process becomes so flawed or intentionally biased, or people are fully aware of how wrong they're getting things without ever actually doing anything about improving their mechanisms and processes, that if they're so sloppy that it can be regarded as being misleading by design, then we might be entering the territory of fake news. And finally, FN Star does not demand that the purveyors of fake news must always be driven by strongly held beliefs on their part. So instead, it insists that the misleading nature of fake news is the result of systemic features inherent in the way it's chosen and presented. In other words, it's due to the way the process of generation and propagation is designed. I think that's, to my mind at least, what really makes the specific difference of fake news. If we want to capture a real underlying and to some extent novel phenomenon, then it's going to be the systemic dimension of how fake news operates. And this brings me to my final point, the very recent upsurge of fake news, which of course is one of the main reasons for inquiring and main motivations for why we want to inquire into the concept, and which, as I said before, should itself be seen as an explanandum. So a prospective definition of fake news should be compatible with, at the very least, and even better, ideally help with, giving an account of when fake news is going to be prevalent. Again, it's not the job of the definition to do the explaining, but the definition should certainly be apt for understanding and pinpointing conditions when actual fake news is going to basically hit the public sphere. And I want to argue that the definition I proposed is apt in precisely this way. The key to understanding here lies again in this phrase, by design. Now, if you recall what the definition said, it stated that for a report presented as news to count as an instance of fake news, it must not only be misleading simpliciter, but it must be misleading by design. That is to say, the originators of fake news either intends the content to be misleading in virtue of its specific content, or he deliberately deploys a process of news production and presentation that's designed to result in content that is manipulative in character. And that's precisely what current purveyors of fake news are doing. Because producers of fake news, especially on social media, have begun quite expertly in many cases, of employing strategies of bringing about belief and ensuring its propagation via sharing, for example, on social media. They do so by catering to their consumers' pre-existing biases and heuristics. In other words, by systematically modulating those biases and heuristics and manipulating the users in this way. What are some of these? I'm not going to go to the whole list. That would take up far too much time and probably would be a futile task. I'm just going to mention some recurring aspects of why this is particularly relevant in the case of fake news stories on social media. There are repetition effects, which entail that repeated exposure to the same information, even when the repeat message comes from the same source, and so of course from a rational point of view is really redundant, nonetheless renders that information more persuasive. People are more swayed by what they hear more often. Then there's priming. This is stuck. Okay, priming. Influences, which is by using phrases like crooked Hillary or lying Ted. I mean, I apologize for the dominant use of Donald Trump as an example of in this talk, but there you go. Priming, associating a figure, I mean in this case a political opponent, with morally loaded terms. That can influence the interpretation of subsequent information to the point that it can even invert its meaning. So that's a strategy that's being used, not just by Donald Trump, but in many such cases. And things like affective arousal, which intensifies partisan bias. I know Regina Rini has written on partisan epistemology, so that's a point of overlap there. So partisan bias may lead to affective arousal, which reduces the overall willingness to negotiate a compromise. and may even shut down pathways for rebutting false claims. Because another explanandum is why fake news is as stable as it is, and why one gets these paradoxical effects that even if you try to refute it, you're only going to entrench it even more. And even the tactical co-opting of the phrase, which I mentioned at the beginning a few times, in particular by those in power, notably again Donald Trump, who wish to dismiss legitimate but unflattering news coverage as fake news, that can also further entrench systemic distortions of our epistemic environment. So if you just say it often enough, people will then discount the very sources of good information that might actually, in a sort of objective sense of the word, from an objective standpoint, reduce their prevalence of false and misleading beliefs. So what these examples show, or I hope indicate at least, is that far from being a side effect of fake news, the systemic ways in which fake news mobilizes our cognitive biases and heuristics, and thereby effectively modulates our reasoning, is part and parcel of the function of fake news. Now, fake news is not itself a new phenomenon. Let me make that clear. And I'm not arguing as much. It's all the ingredients, from political and economic interests to universal cognitive biases and heuristics, they have long existed. But there's something distinct and distinctly new, I would argue, about an information infrastructure that is dominated by essentially online social media with their targeted audience-specific manipulation of cognitive biases and heuristics. Or as psychology today puts it much more succinctly, it's basically cognitive biases on steroids. And as a result, we find ourselves, if we now apply sort of my definition that I proposed to the current situation, we find ourselves confronted with publicly disseminated disinformation, which masquerades as news, it passes itself off as news, but whose main purpose is to systematically and systemically feed off our cognitive biases in order to ensure its own continued production and survival. And this itself, of course, should be enough of a motivation for us to subject it to rigorous social epistemological analysis. So even if you find yourself disagreeing with my proposed definition Fn star, I hope that I've convinced you at least of this much, that we as social epistemologists and people interested in the function of this public sphere as a source of reliable information, we should all at least engage with, as many of you already do and will in their talks, with the topic of fake news as a topic of social epistemological analysis. So thank you very much.